I would say one of the crucial pieces to this is continuing to educate. Because what I saw personally was a lot of people who had no idea what DEI was, and the first thing they were getting introduced to it was someone telling them that there was a quota system. It was anti-meritocracy, and my retort to that is I think DEIA is the ultimate meritocracy. Right, you have in order for it to really truly have the best person for a position, it has to be open to everybody, right? And so I personally feel that if we talk about what it is in a true open way, that I think nobody would be against it.
Welcome. This is part 2 of a conversation with leaders at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, where we talk about the future of DEIA, that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in homeless response. Check out the link in the description to part 1 of this conversation and subscribe to our feed to get notified when part 3 comes out. Let's dive in. So let's talk a little bit about the homeless response sector in particular. Some people think that without DEI or DEIA initiatives, we would have a world we'd be able to have a world that's colorblind, where people get treated without regard to race. Was the homeless response system colorblind prior to DEIA initiatives, and would it be colorblind if we dropped them?
That's a great question. And a part of me wants to say that our society has never been colorblind. If you look back for hundreds of years when race was, sort of derived as a social construct, I'd like to draw actually on some research from someone in our field, Dr. Earl James Edwards, who talks about the consequences of colorblind homeless policies in his research. And the powerful statement that he makes throughout this research is that colorblind approaches do not take into consideration the nuance and history of specific groups. And while he is focusing specifically on anti-Black policies, I would actually take that a step further to just name that it is a fact that certain individuals and groups are more likely to become homeless when you compare them to the U.S. population. And that expands race and ethnicity. We're talking about people with disabilities. We're talking about older adults. We are talking about young people that are ages 18 through 24 that might identify as gay or transgender, who have double the risk of experiencing homelessness compared to their straight counterparts. People in rural communities, they're often undercounted and invisible in really vast geographies. So when I think about colorblind, I think less about race and ethnicity and more about the fact that you have different groups. That is a part of what makes the fabric of our nation so rich. And some of those groups have different needs, and there's nothing wrong with developing policies and programs that, take into consideration those needs.
Yeah, and I would echo, as I worked in the system prior to, some of your C4 Spark reports, some of the recent, more focus on equity, where I would say that not the entire system was colorblind. I'm sure there's pockets around the country who were very specific in trying to target their resources. But I would say from a national standpoint, there wasn't a lot of focus on the individual subpopulations that were disproportionately experiencing homelessness, i.e., Black and brown folks, are LGBTQI. A2S spirit youth. 2S youth. There just wasn't the focus wasn't as targeted as it needed to be, which ends up when that happens, as we saw with the GI Bill, right? When the GI Bill, even though it wasn't targeted towards any one group, it was colorblind. So what ended up happening was that the majority of the resources went to white veterans, right? And so if we know that if we don't understand the specific needs of the folks we're serving, specifically folks who are disproportionately experiencing homelessness, we can't design services and resources, interventions that best meet their needs. So we provide this one-size-fits-all approach that unfortunately we saw that didn't do anything about the disproportionality of folks experiencing homelessness, because we are only addressing the surface level of homelessness and not the systemic issues that's led to someone's homelessness.
So can we back up a second? Because you mentioned the Spark report a moment ago. Would either of you like to go into a little more detail about what the Spark report was, what we learned from it, and sort of how the homeless system has responded to it?
So SPARK stands for Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities, and the Center for Social Innovation actually launched a quantitative and qualitative research project across a number of communities, I think 10 or 11 throughout the country. And in this effort, they really took a deep dive into the data of different communities. And they found that there were a number of, disproportionalities related to who is more likely to experience homelessness, with a real focus on barriers to exiting homelessness and also how people are becoming homeless in the first place. So this, was the late 2010s, so 2016, 17, 2018. And one of the catalysts that the Spark initiative provided for our field was just greater visibility around understanding our data, not from just the numbers standpoint, but also the stories, the human stories behind the numbers and what their actual lived experiences were on their journey into and out of homelessness.
And I will speak a little bit to the system prior to. So when I remember working in the shelter, and I want to say it was anywhere from 80 to 90% of the people we served were Black. But we didn't highlight that or anything like that with our policies. We didn't have the conversation. When the conversation was raised, not necessarily where I work, but like on in a more general sense, the response was usually, we don't have the research, we don't have the data, we don't have the understanding, even though we, a lot of ways do have the data. The Spark report gave voice to a lot of the things. I think a lot of the backroom conversations that might have been happening across the country, and it gave a place that we can point to and say, well, look here. This is the research that backs up what we're seeing, what we kind of understand to be true, and really began that conversation. I think prior to seeing the great group of folks who presented on this, I've only heard race mentioned one other time in a homelessness context, and so it's like it allowed for race, other identities to be normalized in the conversation around how do we best address homelessness.
And the other piece I would add to that, Josh, thank you for providing that additional context, is it prompted communities into action, and that specific action was raising awareness of interrogating who was entering their system and why, to really get to those root causes that you mentioned a moment ago, Josh.
One of the things that really came out of the C4, the Spark report, was that every other subgroup, if you look at how they present their demographics in the United States, then you look at their representation of poverty, and then it's usually the underrepresentation of folks who are in poverty or experiencing homelessness. But Black folks were the only folks who their number of folks experiencing homelessness actually was more than their representation in poverty, meaning that poverty alone wasn't the only driver of homelessness for Black folks, which I think historically, as we always talked about homelessness, we talk about homelessness as a poverty issue, and then for folks who are in extreme poverty ending up in homelessness. For that report gave light to that's not always true, and there's other factors, and they mentioned like network impoverishment that leads to folks who aren't necessarily in poverty to end up homelessness.
So, how do DEIA initiatives play out specifically in homeless response, or how should they play out?
That's a really great question. I think what we are seeing communities do is explore and understand why more people from specific groups are becoming homeless. And that is kind of twofold. People in communities are looking at other systems like the healthcare system, the criminal legal system, education, immigration, child welfare, because each of these systems in some way contribute to the inequities that we see. They can be called feeder systems because they are feeding people into homelessness. And oftentimes those systems don't necessarily work in favor of specific groups along racial, ethnic, geographic parameters. So I think the other important piece here is that communities continue to examine their own response systems, and they are actively working to identify and correct policies that might be unnecessarily prohibitive to certain groups of people. They're working on correcting processes. They're working on, revising assessment tools. They're working on ways to really reduce things in a system that really increase unfair outcomes. And then the other piece I would say is we've seen a bit of a movement that I consider to be a part of any equity initiative, which is expanding the engagement and opportunity for people who have lived through homelessness, people who have navigated systems, people who have exited homelessness, working alongside those folks to tap into their really intimate knowledge of what works and what doesn't. And we've got a long way to go, but we are starting to see many communities work alongside people with lived experience of homelessness to make some course corrections. And it's not easy, it's not overnight work, but communities are definitely creating more meaningful engagement opportunities to help refine the systems that exist.
Yeah, and yes to everything you stated, Mary Frances. Another piece to it is in how we view the hiring practices within the homeless response system. Who's doing the work? Who's making the decision? And I want to be clear: it's not coming at it from any type of arbitrary quota or like putting people in places where they're not fit, they don't have the experience or the knowledge to do so, but ensuring that we're pulling from a diverse pot of folks to for job openings. We don't have policies that keep people from actually accessing the employment in the homeless response system. We're looking at ways to create internships that are diverse, looking for ways for people to access, you know, more senior positions in organizations, and really looking at who's making the policy, asking the questions: do we look like the people we're serving? And then ultimately, when you have that internal review of the diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, then are we providing the interventions in a way that meets everyone's needs? And how do we do that? We look at our data by disaggregating it and looking at it and using intersectional identities to see if the services to see if the services that we are providing meet everyone's individual needs. And then it's an iterative process, right? Where it's a continual evolution to just ensure that we're doing the work to end homelessness. I would say one of the crucial pieces to this is continuing to educate, because what I saw personally was a lot of people who had no idea what DEI was, and the first time they were getting introduced to it was someone telling them that there was a quota system, it was anti-meritocracy, and my retort to that is I think DEIA is the ultimate meritocracy, right? In order for it to really truly have the best person for a position, it has to be open to everybody, right? And so I think I personally feel that if we talk about what it is in a true open way, that I think nobody would be against it.